Hello, I'm Anthony. Today I want to talk to you about the process of recording audio in Cubase. And the conversation that we're going to have today is going to be from a very me-centric basis. I am in a home recording studio here. I'm in my office at home. There's a road outside along which trucks and cars quite regularly drive. And I want to talk to you about the various challenges that are involved in that today from two different perspectives. Primarily this thing, getting the microphone recorded properly, and predominantly in the way that I speak to you today. I'm going to show you the various inserts and effects that I have to get the sound out of my voice into this thing, but also from the perspective of recording guitar, generally an overview of how to record audio in this home studio recording environment. Hope you find this video useful today. If you do, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. So how do we get audio into Cubase? Well, obviously you're going to need an audio interface. I have a Focusrite 18i8 and here it is. And I have two inputs that I want to talk to you about today. Inputs 3 and 4 on the front of my device are the microphone and guitar input respectively. You'll also see a 48 volt light lit. This microphone is active. It's an AT2020 and it's a powered microphone. It requires 48 volts to power. This light on Focusrite, and this is a peculiar thing about Focusrites, they power their inputs in pairs. So input 4 is also powered, but a 1/4-inch jack doesn't carry power. It's the third cable on an XLR cable that actually carries the power supply. So it's perfectly safe to have a guitar cable plugged into a 48 volt input. It's just a peculiarity of the Focusrite. So let's see how we get those two inputs into Cubase. And we start off with the studio setup, and in the audio system we've got a subheading with my hardware input, and as you can see now, here are all of the inputs and outputs on my device. It's an 18i8, so 18 in, 8 out, and the two that we're concentrating on are inputs 3 and 4. The show as column is editable. You can click in here and label these things to whatever happens to be connected to that input, and I strongly recommend that you do, because you'll see these labels throughout the system. Everywhere where you're wanting to connect this input to somewhere in Cubase, you're going to see this label. It's going to make it really easy to keep track of what's connecting to what. So make sure you label all of these inputs and outputs. And if you're not using an input, uncheck this visible checkbox. As you can see, I've got a couple of strange inputs here. 1 and 2 are actually something called a loopback system. In order for me to be able to talk to you through Cubase and record this information in OBS, I need to jump through quite a few kind of weird hoops, and inputs 1 and 2 on my audio interface allow me to do that, but I don't want to see them in Cubase. Cubase has no interest in those inputs whatsoever, and so they're not marked as visible. What we're interested in today is inputs 3 and 4. We're going to start off with the easiest one first. Let's do the guitar chain. So we'll start off with input 4. Here's my mono guitar in, configured in my studio setup. From that point, I need to come out of there and head into audio connections. And on the inputs tab, this is where I configure my guitar input. Now, can you see this guitar M in? That's the thing we labeled in the studio setup. If I drop this down, you can see the only other option available to me is mic in, because they're the boxes that I had ticked as visible in studio setup. So keep things as clean as possible, as simple as possible. And then when you're configuring these things later on down the chain, it makes things really, really easy to follow. So I've created a bus. You just click add bus and give it the name mono guitar in, and this is it. Everything in the input tab is really, really straightforward. You're not seeing the microphone input here because I use the control room for that. We'll get to that later. Let's just follow the guitar through the system first. So now that I've got an audio connection, when I come to create a new guitar track, so I've selected the audio tab, and here are all of the options available to me. Here's my mono guitar in input. Now I have the option to specify whether or not this is a mono or stereo track. When I'm recording guitar, I prefer to leave them as stereo, and there really isn't any reason why I need to set this configuration to mono, so I basically create all of my guitar tracks as stereo. We're not going to worry about output routing today. That's a different conversation. We're really talking about how to get stuff recorded into the system. And that's all we need. Once I've set up my audio input and I've specified that it's going to be a stereo track, I can click add track and create it. And here it is. So now here's my guitar sat on the table next to me. Basically just going to strum that. I need to enable monitor in order that I can hear it. And if I get my output levels right so that it doesn't blow the speakers, there you go. So I've now got an active input connected through my hardware interface, configured via Studio Setup, routed through the audio connections, and here I now have a live guitar track ready to record. Now, in terms of getting my input levels, you see when I was kind of just preparing then and had my level set a little bit too high, the guitar input here peaked. So let's talk about setting your input levels properly. You'll see a lot of advice on the internet as to how much headroom to leave yourself when you're recording audio. As much as in some cases you'll see as much as 20 dB of headroom. I think that's just way too much. As long as you're even remotely careful about what you're recording, you can be a little bit what's called hotter than that. In other words, record a stronger signal. Generally speaking, the bigger the audio signal, the hotter the signal that you record, the less noise you're going to introduce into the system when you turn that thing up to get to a reasonable level to mix with the rest of the song. The absolute golden rule, however, is that you must never exceed 0 dB. In a digital environment, exceeding 0 dB is not one of these things where you start introducing grit or warmth or any terms that would be used in the analog world. It's objectively and absolutely bad. Now I'm going through guitar effects here to get that signal to the Focusrite in the first place. I might even have my Fender amp turned on, in which case I'm generating a genuinely analog signal. It's going through an attenuator, granted, in order for me to get it into this input signal. But basically, however I get my signal out of the guitar into this Focusrite, if we treat the Focusrite as the kind of the first port of call that we're interested in, from today's perspective, we want the input signal to it to be as healthy as possible. Now, it doesn't take much at this point with the levels as I've got them set. Do you hear that crackle? That's because the input signal from the guitar is basically too hot to allow me to do that thing. In other words, the signal coming into Cubase is too big for Cubase to handle, and that's why this red light is coming on my guitar input. This is the single truth, the absolute truth of the information getting into Cubase, and it's my audio interface's responsibility to give this signal to Cubase. So if I strum a chord in a way that I'm likely to do when I'm actually come to recording the part, let's say I want to play it that loud and that red light comes on, it means the signal coming out of the Focusrite is too big, it's too hot. So I'll need to turn that down. So let's say I do that from my multi-effects unit that's sat over here. Let's try strumming the same chord at about the same volume. Okay, now I can play that chord quite comfortably, and I'm no longer peaking. So the signal getting into the Focusrite is a big, thick, healthy, strong signal. The Focusrite is effectively a conduit. It's just passing that signal along. It's not really doing anything to the input signal. One final point to make in this regard, it's entirely dependent, and I'm kind of sorry if I'm teaching you to suck eggs here because this is really obvious stuff. It's entirely dependent what you play. Now, if I'm playing a solo line, see how much smaller the signal is now. Even when I play those notes, there you go, I just managed to make it peak then by hitting it really pretty hard. But if I'm soloing, the moment I hit a chord, I better make it peak though. Yeah, very, very easily. So if I'm going to start jamming out the kind of signal's way, way too strong, and again, I'm going to need to attenuate my levels according and appropriate to what I'm playing. This isn't one of these set and forget things. You don't get your input levels right and you never worry about them again. It's entirely dependent on what you're playing, and I want to get this signal as strong as I can. Generally speaking, I work up to about -4 to -6. I like to have a little bit of headroom so that the signal coming in really stands no chance whatsoever of peaking. but I'm perfectly happy to have it really quite hot. And if I'm then going to go on and do processing on it, maybe send it into an effects unit that's going to add several dB on because it's got like a distortion or something, I'll pull that down from inside Cubase. At least I've got this big, fat, healthy signal, and I'm not worried about giving myself 10 dB of headroom. It's really easy to reduce gain, but you can't fix something that's distorted. Once it's distorted, it's gone forever. Just a quick word about this monitoring light, by the way. I turned the monitor on in order to enable me to hear the guitar as it was coming into the track. If I turn the monitor off and strum the guitar, you can probably hear it acoustically, but you can't hear it coming through Cubase. So the monitor light, as far as input tracks are concerned, is essential in order for you to be able to hear the thing. And the reason I make that caveat is because that's not true for the control room. So now it's time for us to have a look at vocals, and this is a slightly more complicated story. I'm going to head back into audio connections, but this time we're not worried about the input tab, because as I said earlier, my microphone input comes via the control room. So this is the talkback mechanism. This little microphone symbol on the control room is a talkback mechanism. Now, configuring the control room is quite a big subject, and that's not what we're going to worry too much about today. Suffice to say, you can add different kinds of channels to a control room, and you have one talkback channel that you can assign, which is why when I pull this add channel dialog down, I don't have the option to add another one because I've already created one. So here's my talkback channel in the control room, and it's mono because my microphone is mono. And here's my device port with mic in. When we configured Studio Setup right at the beginning, this is what I called input 3 that's plugged into my Focusrite. So the microphone signal comes into input 3 and goes straight into the control room, ignoring the input tab. And the beauty of configuring my microphone to go through the control room rather than a regular input track is that I get to decouple the stereo output from the microphone. So if I'm talking to you over the top of a song that's playing in the background, I have independent control of the stereo output, which is the entire song, but it's got nothing to do with the microphone signal. That's the control room basically decouples the microphone from everything else in the system and allows me to treat it completely independently for when I'm making videos for you. If I didn't make videos for YouTube, I probably wouldn't use the control room. I'm not sure. There are some really cool features about it, but I have it configured this way because of my personal requirements. Now, aside from the peculiarity of my microphone coming in through the control room, it's just another audio input. The difference is that when I create an audio track using a control room input, I'm not going to monitor it in quite the same way. I'm going to create an audio track now. And this time I'm going to choose, let's just stop the thing looping in the background as well. That's annoying. And this time I'm not going to pick my guitar input. I'm going to choose my control room microphone. Here it is. Now, I very rarely apply stereo effects to a vocal, so I could quite happily create this as a mono track. Let's do that today. And we'll say add track. And so this track is now ready for me to record some vocals on it. In fact, if I set the thing recording and start talking over the top of it, you can see that that signal is being fed into Cubase. Over the top of it, you can see that that signal is, and there it is. Now again, I want to get this signal as big and strong as possible when I'm recording it. See, if I recorded a signal like that, I would go back and change these settings because that is not a strong enough audio signal. Just like any other audio track, you can add insert effects to a control room track and it has its own tab. Here are the inserts, and you can see there's quite a lot going on the insert track of my control room, and I'll talk about each of these today. This is the default that I have configured when I'm making a YouTube video. This isn't the same configuration that I would use if I was recording my wife Pauline singing one of my songs, because this is a lot of pre-processing to do on a track. Basically, to bake, all of this stuff gets baked into the audio as it's recorded in Cubase. So let's have a look at each of these inserts. I'll explain why they're there, and then when it comes to you recording vocals or audio in your environment, you might pick and choose whether or not any of these are appropriate to you. So right at the top of the tree, I have a de-esser. That stuff is quite unpleasant if not controlled. My microphone is actually quite close to my mouth here, and that's to help me reduce the ambient noise of my environment. Now the denoiser is doing the majority of that, but you can see every time I make a sibilant sound, that's the de-esser kicking in, just suppressing those S's. If I mute the de-esser and say some sibilant sounds again, then you can hear it, they're far essier than they were when I turn it back on. She sells seashells on the seashore. She sells seashells on the seashore. Coming out of the de-esser, we come into the denoise. Now this is probably the most important of all of the plugins that I use. Now this is Insight's denoiser, and it's the best I've found, and particularly the graphical interface is absolutely fantastic for this. And for the purpose of demonstration, to show you what this thing's doing, I'm going to turn the input level up on my microphone way beyond what I normally would. So now I have to be a little bit careful about how loud I speak, because that's a really hot signal. I'm going to turn the denoise off. Hear that car go past? There's an awful lot of ambient environment. I live next to a very large busy road that way, and a smaller but occasionally quite noisy road this way. I'm basically on a triangle, so I'm surrounded on two sides by roads. It's just too noisy. This is one of the very rare times when I can't actually hear a car. But the denoiser takes care of all of this for me. And what it does is it listens to the ambient environment and sets itself accordingly. So what I'll do is I'll turn it back on. I'll put it in learn mode. And what it basically does is it listens to the ambient environment and sets a suppression curve to cut out what it can hear. And if a car drives past when I'm doing that, I have to basically reset it and do it again. I will quite regularly go into RX7 and reset this voice curve so that it matches the ambient environment. And that really helps suppress a lot of that noise. I'm going to turn the microphone down a little bit now because I'm having difficulty just controlling all of the levels. Back in a sec. Then we go into a compressor. So what this is doing is basically just equalizing the sound of my voice. If I talk slightly quieter in one phrase, slightly louder in the next, the compressor just helps smooth that out. And as you can see, boo, it's really quite a gentle compressor. I have to really kind of say something a little bit loud, boo, in order for it to actually do anything at all. It's just catching those peaks. You can also see, and this is just a generally very good tip when you're doing any sort of kind of audio processing, setting a noise meter on either side and equalizing your two integrated levels. So I basically reset both of these volume meters, loudness meters, and you want the output to be more or less the same as the input. So there's a very, very slight boost there. The signal coming out of the compressor is generally very slightly bigger than the signal going in. But the most important thing is that it's more even and tailoring out those curves. Now this is an Archera compressor, but really any compressor would be absolutely fine. Coming out of the compressor, we go into this Neeve 1081 emulation. So this is a mic preamp, basically just doing a little bit of EQ, fixing, putting a little bit of fizz in my voice. See all of that tingly stuff, not too much of it, but it's very dull if that's turned down. So a little bit of fizz. I'm pulling away some of the 5K stuff, which is tiny little bit of that's being attenuated, and a tiny bit of the muddy 400 hertz nonsense, which makes the sound just a little bit too deep if there's too much of that. So it's a fairly gentle EQ, but it actually has a reasonably significant effect on the sound. If I start talking to you and then mute the EQ as I'm in the middle of talking, you can hear everything just gets duller and flatter and far less interesting. Pull some of that stuff back, and this is what you're hearing when you hear me. So that's on everything that I record. This is my Anthony's YouTube control room setting. In your audio connections, you have the option to set presets. My YouTube control room is the configuration that you can see here. One final plugin to look at, and the reason I mention this is because the requirements of your room, your recording environment, are going to raise challenges that nobody else's environment will. Now, can you see this absolutely crazy EQ curve with this brick wall limiter set at 16,500 hertz? I'm going to disable this brick wall shelf. Here we go. Now, if you're very young, you might be able to hear that. That is a spike at 20 kilohertz that's caused by my solar panel inverter. We have solar panels on this house, and the inverter that converts my solar panel energy into home electricity has a 20 kilohertz spike in it. It's a known fault with this particular manufacturer. They've said, sorry, it is the way it is. And so every recording that I make would have that 20 kilohertz spike on if I didn't attenuate it with this thing. So I basically just, at 16,500 hertz, I'm way too old to hear 16,500 hertz, but anybody fortunate enough to be able to hear that stuff won't hear it because it's egregious and shouldn't be there. So this is just, again, one of these things that as you're recording, as you're setting up your particular circumstances and you're doing recording, and if you come across anything unusual, you need to be flexible enough to be able to say, I need to sort that out. There's a second one over here. Occasionally, and it depends what I've got plugged into where. At the moment, my system's behaving itself reasonably well, but occasionally I will get a 50 hertz hum, which is my ground loop issues. And if I do, I have this very, very steep cut that just pulls away 50 hertz. Again, nothing I ever really need to worry about, and my default is to have that disabled. But if I'm ever looking at an EQ profile in one of my noise monitors and I see something going wrong at 50 hertz, if I just want to pull that out of the system and have nothing to do with it, I've got a standardized EQ profile that I can load up just to pull that specific thing away. And as I say, ordinarily, it's not an issue, and so it can basically stay out of the way. And when I did that little recording of myself earlier, we had that really, really weak signal. If I was actually going to record me making any noise into Cubase, I wouldn't use my YouTube profile. I would use a different profile. I'd head into my audio connections and I would load up the singing control room, which, as you can see, has a much, much simpler profile. So in this case, I'm literally just doing my brick wall limiter. It's actually engaged. Turn that off. Got my 15K, pulling that horrible 20 kilohertz spike out. And this is a much less intrusive EQ. You can see I've got basically an almost essentially flat EQ here. This is the thing that I would use to set up my levels. And as I'm recording, I'll basically just adjust either the input gain from the control room or on the front of the Focusrite. They're basically doing the same job, but I wouldn't be talking to you. See, there's quite a big distance between my mouth and the microphone here. If I really wanted to record into Cubase, I would come much closer, and it's amazing how small the difference is, particularly with a powered mic, a condenser mic like this. You get too close. I have to really be careful, don't want to get too ASMR, but that's basically what you're going to worry about. But adjusting input levels on microphones is exactly the same as you would do for the guitars. You basically want to get it nice and hot. See, that's a perfectly reasonable signal. Be quite happy with something like that. So you see those little spikes. Nothing's getting anywhere near 0 dB. Totally reasonable. And when you're recording using the control room, you don't need to enable monitoring because you can already hear yourself. You can hear your control room microphone all the time. That's the whole point of TalkBack. So we don't need to engage the monitor. That's my audio input setup. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.